Imagine a world where the air doesn't just bite, it consumes. Where every breath feels like swallowing shards of broken glass, and the simple act of blinking can freeze your eyelashes shut forever. You've seen the Green Berets in the sweltering jungles of Vietnam and the scorched sands of Iraq. But what happens when America's most elite, quiet professionals are dropped into the heart of a Siberian-style hellscape? We are talking about a place so cold that metal becomes brittle as cracker crust and your own sweat can become a suit of ice that slowly strangles your heart. Today, we're peeling back the classified curtain on a training evolution so brutal, so psychologically shattering, that it changed the way special forces look at winter warfare forever. The aftermath wasn't just a debrief, it was a reckoning. Before we dive into the frozen abyss of this mission, I want to see the reach of our global community. Drop a comment right now and tell us, where are you watching from? Are you in the warmth of the tropics, or are you shivering in a winter of your own? Stay tuned because the aftermath isn't just a title, it's a warning. The legend of the Green Beret is built on the foundation of adaptability, the idea that a 12-man operational detachment alpha can survive and thrive in any environment on the planet, but nothing prepares a human being for the absolute metabolic tax of sub-zero warfare. When the United States Special Forces initiated a series of drills designed to mimic the exact conditions of the Russian general winter, they weren't just looking for tactical proficiency, they were testing the literal breaking point of human biology. These drills took place in the most unforgiving corridors of the high north, where the mercury plummeted to levels that rendered standard-issue gear useless and turned tactical movement into a grueling fight for every inch of ground. The objective was simple: survive, maneuver, and strike in conditions where the environment itself kills more men than the enemy ever could. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on the first day, the reality of the situation began to set in, and the elite status of the men involved felt like a very thin shield against the encroaching wall of ice. It wasn't just cold, it was a predatory atmosphere that seemed to watch for the slightest mistake, waiting for a single glove to be lost or a tent zipper to snag so it could begin the process of shutting down a soldier's vital organs. The aftermath of the first 48 hours was described by witnesses as a scene from a forgotten war, with men who had survived IED blasts and mountain ambushes looking visibly shaken by the sheer indifference of the climate. In the Russian philosophy of winter warfare, the cold is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a weapon to be wielded, and the Green Berets were finding out that their Western training emphasized beating the cold rather than becoming it. This fundamental disconnect led to a series of cascading failures in the initial drills, where the high-tech equipment the U.S. relies on began to fail in spectacular fashion, with batteries draining in minutes and lubricants and weapons turning into a thick, adhesive paste that jammed the firing pins of even the most reliable rifles. The aftermath of these gear failures meant that the Berets were forced to revert to primitive survival methods, huddling together for warmth and using primitive fires that gave away their positions to opt for units who were moving through the snow like ghosts. It was a brutal wake-up call that showed that in the Arctic, the most advanced military in the world could be neutralized by nothing more than a few days of heavy snowfall and a consistent wind chill. As the drills progressed into the deep freeze phase, the psychological aftermath became the most concerning factor for the commanders overseeing the exercise, as sleep deprivation combined with extreme hypothermia began to erode the cognitive functions of the team leaders. A Green Beret is trained to process complex data under fire, but at -40 degrees, the brain's processing speed slows down as the body shunts blood away from the prefrontal cortex to protect the core, leading to a state of cold-induced stupor. Men were found staring blankly at maps they had memorized weeks prior, unable to orient themselves because the landscape had been erased by a whiteout that lasted for 36 hours straight. The aftermath of this sensory deprivation was a spike in near-miss accidents, with soldiers nearly walking off ridgelines or losing track of their teammates in the blinding spindrift that turned the world into a featureless void of white. It became clear that the brutality of the drill wasn't just in the physical pain, but in the loss of the very self-reliance that defines the Special Forces spirit, leaving them feeling vulnerable in a way they hadn't experienced since the earliest days of selection. One of the most harrowing accounts from the aftermath involved a specific react-to-contact drill where the Green Berets were ambushed by a simulated Russian Spetsnaz unit that had been acclimated to the environment for weeks. The American team, weighed down by heavy parkas and struggling with the sheer exhaustion of moving through waist-deep snow, found it nearly impossible to achieve the violence of action required to repel the attack. Their movements were sluggish, their communication was muffled by thick face masks, and the simple act of dropping to a prone position resulted in several soldiers becoming cold-soaked as the snow melted against their warm bodies and then refroze into a layer of ice. The aftermath of this specific engagement was a total wipeout of the ODA, proving that in a high-intensity winter conflict, the side that is better adapted to the environment will win every single time, regardless of technological superiority or individual marksman skills. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a group of men who pride themselves on being the apex predators of the battlefield, realizing they were currently the prey in this frozen ecosystem. When the teams were finally rotated out of the hot zone for medical evaluation, the clinical aftermath was a catalog of horrors that highlighted the true cost of operating in the Russian-style winter drills. Doctors treated numerous cases of high-altitude pulmonary edema and stage 2 frostbite, with some soldiers losing the tips of their fingers or toes to the black death of frozen tissue that simply refused to revive. But even more striking was the weight loss. The sheer caloric demand of staying warm in those conditions meant that some men had lost upwards of 15 pounds in just a week, their bodies literally consuming their own muscle mass to keep their hearts beating. The aftermath of this physical toll meant that the recovery time for these drills was twice as long as a standard desert or jungle rotation, with many berets suffering from long-term nerve damage and a heightened sensitivity to cold that could potentially end their careers in the field. This wasn't just a tough week at the office. It was a systemic trauma to the human frame that left the elite operators questioning the sustainability of long-term Arctic operations without a total overhaul of their doctrine. The logistical aftermath was equally devastating, as the heavy vehicles and snowmobiles used by the Green Berets were found to be woefully inadequate for the terrain, often getting bogged down in sugar snow that offered no traction for tracks or tires. The drills revealed that the U.S. military's reliance on fuel-hungry machines was a liability in the deep north, where supply lines are easily severed by storms, and the aftermath of a mechanical breakdown often meant certain death for the crew if they weren't rescued within a few hours. In contrast, the drills showed that more traditional low-tech methods, such as the use of skis, pulks, and even pack animals, were often more effective at maintaining mobility in the extreme cold. The aftermath of these findings led to a frantic re-evaluation of the Special Forces equipment budget, with a new emphasis on over-snow mobility that prioritized reliability and simplicity over high-tech sensors and heavy armor that simply couldn't handle the thermal contraction of the Siberian-style climate. Beyond the physical and logistical failures, the aftermath of the Green Berets' encounter with Russian-style winter tactics highlighted a massive gap in Arctic intelligence and the ability to read the terrain. The Russian soldiers they were simulating have centuries of institutional knowledge on how to use the winter as a force multiplier, such as using snow caves for thermal masking against thermal optics or setting ice traps in frozen rivers to swallow enemy vehicles. The Green Berets found that their standard tactical SOPs were actually working against them, as their tendency to stay in tight formations made them easy targets for the long-range whiteout snipers, who specialized in picking off targets during storms when visibility was at its lowest. The aftermath of these drills necessitated a complete rewrite of the Special Forces Mountain and Cold Weather Manual, incorporating the brutal lessons learned from being outmaneuvered by an environment they thought they understood but had only merely visited in the past. The emotional aftermath for the families of the operators was a silent but heavy burden, as the men returned from the drills looking like ghosts of their former selves, with hollow eyes and a 1,000-yard stare that is usually reserved for those returning from active combat zones. The brutality of the winter drills had stripped away the bravado, leaving behind a group of men who were acutely aware of their own mortality and the fragility of the systems they relied upon for survival. There were reports of cold anxiety among the troops, a lingering psychological effect where the sound of wind or the sight of falling snow would trigger a low-level fight-or-flight response, a testament to the sheer intensity of the suffering they had endured. This aftermath forced the Special Operations Command to invest more heavily in psychological resilience training specifically for the Arctic, recognizing that the mental fortitude required to stay sane in a month-long polar night is fundamentally different from the mental strength needed for a door-kicking mission in a desert city. In the tactical aftermath, the Green Berets began to experiment with indigenous survival techniques borrowed from the Inuit and the Sami people, realizing that these cultures had mastered the art of living with the cold rather than fighting it. They started incorporating traditional skin-on-frame sleds and fur-lined garments into their kits, finding that natural materials often outperformed the synthetic Gore-Tex layers when the temperatures dropped below a certain critical threshold. The aftermath of this shift was a more hybrid approach to Special Forces gear, combining the best of modern technology with the ancient wisdom of those who have survived the Arctic for millennia. It was a humbling transition for the world's most modern army, but it was a necessary one, as the drills had proven that nature doesn't care about your rank or your budget. It only cares if you are prepared to play by its rules or if you are willing to die in your defiance. The international aftermath of these drills sent shockwaves through the NATO alliance, as the brutal results were shared with partners who are also facing a resurgent threat in the high north. The realization that even the legendary Green Berets struggled so mightily against the Russian winter model served as a Sputnik moment for Arctic defense, leading to a massive increase in joint training exercises like Cold Response and Arctic Forge. The aftermath was a renewed focus on interoperability in the ice, with special forces from Norway, Sweden, and Finland providing the Green Berets with the ground truth on how to survive a Siberian-style onslaught. These partnerships became the cornerstone of a new northern strategy, but the memory of those initial brutal drills remains a haunting reminder of how close the elite forces came to total catastrophic failure when they first tried to conquer the cold on their own terms. As the debriefing documents were slowly declassified, the aftermath revealed a series of black swan events during the drills that had previously been hushed up, including a localized avalanche that buried a small reconnaissance team for nearly 4 hours. The only reason those men survived was due to a desperate last-minute radio call that barely cut through the atmospheric interference caused by a solar flare, a phenomenon that is common in the Arctic but rarely accounted for in standard tactical planning. The aftermath of this near-tragedy led to the development of specialized Arctic beacons and redundant communication systems that don't rely on the fragile satellite links that are so often blocked by the curvature of the Earth or the thickness of the ice clouds. It was another example of how the environment itself acted as a third-party combatant, constantly sabotaging the Green Berets' efforts to maintain control over the situation and forcing them into a reactive, survival-oriented posture. The aftermath also changed the way Green Berets are selected for specific missions, with commanders now looking for a certain metabolic profile and a specific psychological temperament that can handle the extreme isolation of the North. It was found that some of the most physically dominant soldiers, the powerhouses of the unit, actually struggled the most in the cold because their high muscle mass required too much oxygen and calories, leading to faster burnout and a higher risk of hypothermia. The aftermath of this data resulted in a shift toward selecting leaner, high-endurance operators for Arctic detachments. Men who could sustain a low-level burn 4 weeks at a time without needing the massive caloric intake of a bodybuilder. This biometric aftermath is now a standard part of Special Forces mission planning, ensuring that the team sent into the ice is biologically optimized for the specific challenges of the frozen frontier, rather than just being the strongest guys in the room. Looking back at the aftermath of the Russian winter drills, it's clear that the experience served as a crucible that forged a new generation of Arctic warriors who are far more capable than their predecessors. The brutality of the drills was a necessary evil, a controlled failure that allowed the United States to identify its weaknesses before they could be exploited in a real-world conflict with a peer adversary. The aftermath is a Special Forces community that no longer scoffs at the general winter myths but respects them as a tactical reality that must be studied with the same intensity as counterterrorism or cyber warfare. The Green Berets who walked out of those frozen woods were different men, harder, wiser, and deeply respectful of the power of the natural world, having seen firsthand how quickly the elite label can be stripped away by a simple drop in temperature. The long-term aftermath of these drills is visible today in the Arctic strategy of the Pentagon, which has pivoted toward a mobile defense model that emphasizes small, highly autonomous teams capable of living off the land for months at a time. The lessons of the Green Berets have trickled down to the conventional forces, leading to better cold weather gear for the average infantryman and a more robust logistical tail that can operate in the extreme latitudes. But for the men who were actually there, the aftermath is something more personal, a shared bond of suffering that only those who have faced the ice can truly understand. They speak of the drills in hushed tones, not as a point of pride, but as a survival story that they were lucky to tell, a reminder that in the grand scheme of the universe, even the most elite soldiers are just tiny specks of warmth in a cold, indifferent cosmos. In the final aftermath, the story of the Green Berets facing the Russian winter drills serves as a cautionary tale for any modern military that thinks technology can replace the need for old-school survival skills and environmental adaptation. The brutal reality of the ice is that it doesn't care about your politics, your technology, or your training. It only cares if you are prepared to endure. As the world's powers turn their eyes toward the melting Arctic and the resources hidden beneath the frost, the lessons of those drills will become the iron law of the North. The Green Berets have shown that while they can be broken by the cold, they can also be rebuilt by it, emerging as a force that is truly da oppresso liber, to free the oppressed, even in the darkest, coldest corners of the earth. The aftermath is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a new, frozen chapter in the history of special operations.